Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
We're diving into something today that it feels less like friendly advice
Yeah.
and more like, well, honestly, a necessary caution.
Mm-hmm.
Forget what you thought you knew about, simple charm or just being influential, because we're exploring a side of human interaction that's so potent, potentially so unsettling, that the source material we're using, it actually labels it explicitly as forbidden and dangerous.
That's absolutely right. We've got some deeply fascinating and frankly quite stark material here. It really doesn't pull any punches.
No.
It goes straight to the core of these incredibly powerful psychological strategies, techniques that, and the material puts it with this kind of unnerving precision, cut deep into another person's emotions.
Wow.
Yeah, this isn't about, gentle persuasion or just building rapport through shared interest. It's presented as tapping into raw, fundamental emotional energy, often by design.
Exactly. And the mission for this deep dive, it feels absolutely critical, doesn't it? And it comes with a heavy responsibility. We need to understand these powerful dynamics. The source suggests they hold this potential to profoundly transform connection, attraction, influence. And yes, that possibility is, I guess, inherently magnetic. But the absolute core message, the one that just echoes through every single part of this material, is about the significant risks involved.
Yeah.
It practically screams out the absolute need for awareness, for caution, and for integrity.
It doesn't bury it at all. There's an explicit warning right up front, almost like, a label on a volatile substance.
Right.
It presents these strategies not as like tools for everyone to just pick up and play with, but as something you must be warned about. It's framed as possessing almost forbidden knowledge, delving into what it calls the darker side of influence. It's explicitly stated not to be used lightly.
And this warning, it isn't just theoretical, is it? It's grounded in the reality that misusing these tactics, it leads to real emotional harm, potentially even exploitation.
Absolutely.
We're talking about techniques that are powerful precisely because they bypass those typical social filters and operate on a much deeper psychological level than, just pleasantries or rational arguments. This is about influence, seduction, deep connection, call it what you will, but it's presented with sharpened edges. That phrase really stuck with me.
It's vivid, isn't it? And the source identifies 5 specific tactics that fall into this potent, potentially dangerous category. They are mixing pleasure with pain, choosing the right target, creating a need, mastering the art of insinuation, and entering their spirit. Each one, individually, is described as capable of wielding significant power and impact on another person's emotional state and perception.
And it's just crucial to get this. Exploring how these tactics work is completely inseparable from that constant thread of caution. This material isn't trying to be a user manual on how to manipulate someone.
No, definitely not.
It is emphatically a guide to understanding how potent emotional influence and potentially manipulation can happen. Often beneath conscious awareness, both yours and theirs, you're being given insight into dynamics that can be immensely powerful. And therefore, the source insists they require immense responsibility if you even just recognize them.
It's about recognizing these forces, maybe in the world around you, perhaps in interactions you witness, and this takes some brutal honesty. Even glimpses of them in your own past interactions or tendencies, it fundamentally challenges so many conventional beliefs about what creates depth, what creates impact, what creates that unforgettable connection.
So, yeah, buckle up, I guess. We're stepping onto ground that's described as powerful, but explicitly stated as being safe only for those who dare to embrace the full complexity of human psychology.
Right.
And woven into that dare is a big, bold, unmissable label. Proceed with awareness. These aren't games. They're described as psychological keys that can unlock profound connection, but also, terrifyingly, lock doors or break trust irrevocably.
Okay. So, having set the stage with those powerful warnings, that explicit framing from the source, let's step carefully into the first of these 5 tactics. As you said, these methods, they represent a significant departure from our typical notions of building attraction or connection. They're designed to bypass the superficial and aim directly for deeper, often hidden emotional states.
Absolutely. The first one is called Mixed Pleasure with Pain, the Rhythm of Emotional Gravity. And right away, this tactic just confronts our common assumptions head on, doesn't it?
Totally.
We're usually told, to be appealing, to influence or connect with someone, you should be consistently nice, constantly reassuring, reliably available, always agreeable. The smoother the better, right? That's the standard advice.
And the material vehemently disagrees with that and just throws it out. It argues that this constant, predictable niceness, It actually serves to dull emotion over time.
How so?
Well, when your presence is just this flat line of positive affirmation and comfort, it becomes mundane. It just fades into the background noise of their life. There's no contrast, nothing sharp or unexpected to make the moments you share stand out, you know, to imprint them onto memory or feeling.
Okay, so it's the lack of contrast.
Mhm.
And according to this source, the key to awakening intensity, to creating that magnetic pull, isn't uniformity, but rhythm.
Exactly. Rhythm. It's the unexpected contrasting moments, maybe a touch of mild tension, a brief period of distance, a strategic pause that are essential. It's not the constant sweetness that creates impact, but the pattern of sweetness and something else.
Hmm.
A pattern.
Yes, the source lays out a distinct pattern, almost like a musical phrase. Warmth, followed by a pause, and then a return. This isn't random or chaotic. It's described as having a deliberate cadence to it, a kind of psychological choreography that creates an emotional gravity, pulling the other person inward, focusing their attention on your presence or accents.
Okay, so the critical question then is, why does this pattern work? What's the mechanism? The material explains that the void created by the pause, that moment where you intentionally step back, maybe become quiet, or are just simply absent for a bit.
Right.
It doesn't just create space, it's meant to make their heart race, even if only subtly. It actively stirs longing.
Right, that where did they go feeling.
Precisely. And the tension, the uncertainty, or mild discomfort built during that absence isn't something to be avoided in this model. According to the source, it massively amplifies the sweetness and relief they feel when you return, when the warmth is restored.
So it's the contrast again. The low makes the high feel higher.
Exactly. It's described as tapping into something fundamental about human experience, the fact that we don't just crave constant, bland comfort. We crave emotional variety, highs, lows, experiences that are dynamic and therefore unforgettable. The phrase used is pretty powerful. Smooth is nice, but never leaves a mark.
Wow, okay.
Emotional intensity, the kind that creates deep, lasting impressions and that magnetic pull, is built through variation and contrast, according to this view, not uniformity.
And the source details how this is supposedly done. Again, not as a blueprint for manipulation, but to illuminate the mechanism. It starts with establishing genuine interest and warmth, building that initial connection. Then, the intentional step, creating a slight space.
Slight is key there.
Definitely. And the crucial caveat from the source is that this must not be used as punishment or some kind of power play. It's framed as a silent question left hanging in the air for the other person. Where did I go? That question, unanswered for a moment, is what's intended to stir the longing.
And when you do return, whether it's with comfort, renewed attention, or just shared laughter, the relief they feel is described as profound, almost disproportionate to the length of the absence. It's this sharp contrast between the discomfort of the void and the pleasure of the return that is said to awaken a deeper connection, making your presence feel rare, valuable, and intensely felt.
And this is where those critical risks, the ones inherent in using such a potent tool, just come crashing in. This is absolutely not a simple, foolproof formula, is it?
Not even close. The source issues a stark warning. If you go too harsh, too distant, or stay away for too long during that pause, you risk triggering real hurt, confusion, and ultimately losing them entirely. It's described as requiring a delicate emotional cadence.
Delicate emotional cadence.
Yeah, a specific, fragile rhythm involving sweetness, a brief sting, and then serenity. Getting the balance even slightly wrong is incredibly easy, the source implies, and the consequences are severe.
The warning's explicit. This tactic, this pattern, it can warp the dynamic if carried too long or used incorrectly. The stated goal in the material is to create intensity, to make the connection feel vibrant and alive, but that line into outright manipulation is thin and easily crossed.
So thin. It requires constant, hyper-vigilant awareness of the effect you're having on the other person and, well, a deep well of integrity, frankly.
Let's pause on that. Think about it from the receiving end. Think about moments in your own life when someone you cared about suddenly pulled back, got distant, went quiet without explanation. How did that feel?
Awful, usually. Confusing.
Yeah.
Anxious.
Right. And how did you feel when they eventually returned or reached out again?
Yeah.
Did it make their return feel more significant,
Mm-hmm.
more intense? Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But this tactic, when misused or even just perceived as misuse, it can feel exactly like that, not intentional intensity, but emotional whiplash. a deliberate game of push and pull that feels calculated, manipulative, not genuinely dynamic or passionate.
Absolutely. It starkly highlights how easily this supposedly powerful tool can cross the line into harmful behavior if not handled with the absolute extreme care and awareness the source insists upon. The described power lies in understanding the emotional pendulum, but wielding it, even just understanding it, requires immense ethical reflection.
Which, with that huge caveat echoing, leads us straight into the second tactic outlined, choosing the right target. The source makes it unequivocally clear. Not everyone is susceptible to these kinds of intense emotional dynamics. And attempting to apply these strategies to the wrong person isn't just ethically questionable, but from the source's practical standpoint, it's a complete waste of your emotional energy.
It's presented almost like a fundamental law of this kind of influence. Not a failure on your part if someone doesn't respond, just a mismatch. The core idea here is to focus your energy, this potent emotional approach, on someone who possesses what the source calls an emotional gap.
An emotional gap, what does that mean exactly?
Someone who's described as quietly longing for something meaning, connection, validation, excitement that they feel is missing in their current life. There's a sense of lack, maybe unacknowledged.
And why is identifying this gap considered essential, according to the source?
The reasoning is pretty blunt and direct. Emotional emptiness or a sense of lack makes people inherently open to new connection. They have a space within them that is receptive. In contrast, trying to influence someone who is emotionally full, someone deeply satisfied, content without that sense of lack, is described as being like pouring water on water. It just doesn't create the necessary ripple, the necessary impact.
So it won't land.
Exactly. True influence within this framework is said to happen when your presence, your specific way of being, resonates not just with their superficial interests, but with that silently aching space within them. You aren't creating the gap out of nowhere, according to this description. You are recognizing it, acknowledging it, and positioning yourself as something that might fit into it.
So how does the source suggest you spot someone who might have this emotional gap? Are there signs?
It gives some specific clues, yeah. Almost like scouting for signals. Look for what it calls glimmers, these fleeting moments of vulnerability that they might instinctively try to mask behind routine behaviors or social defenses.
Okay.
Pay close attention to unconscious reactions when you interact, subtle physical tells like a blush, a slight, maybe awkward shift in posture, or a small, odd smile that appears unexpectedly and seems to betray a deeper, hidden feeling.
Interesting.
And perhaps the most intriguing sign described is to look for someone who makes you feel stirred. Not because they're overtly flattering you or playing games, but because interacting with them seems to awaken something in you.
So there's a reciprocal element.
It suggests that, yeah, it implies this isn't meant to be a cold, clinical, one-sided hunt for a vulnerable target, but involves a degree of mutual, albeit potentially unequal, resonance and potential.
And when you reportedly find that right target, that person with the receptive emotional gap, what happens then?
The source says the dance becomes two-way. Your genuine interest, or the application of these techniques, meets their unconscious attraction or inherent receptivity, creating that tension we talked about. The mutual energy, even if it's asymmetrical, means that your subsequent moves within this dynamic are described as feeling natural, desired, or even inevitable from their perspective, rather than forced or unwanted.
Now, the warning here is particularly important, again, just underscoring the ethical tightrope this material describes. What's the specific caution?
The source specifically advises against pursuing or latching onto anyone who gives you instant, easy reassurance or validation. While that might feel good to your ego, the material suggests it could signal boredom on their part, mere polite flattery, or simply a lack of that necessary emotional gap that these tactics are designed to leverage for deep, intense connection. It lacks the tension the source deems necessary.
So patience is key.
Patience is key, the source says. The right person for these dynamics is described as calling to both your heart and your intuition. When that alignment happens, that sense of recognizing the gap and feeling a reciprocal stirring, that's supposedly when everything can deepen.
But we have to call out the language here, don't we? Choosing a target. It sounds predatory.
It absolutely does carry that connotation. And while the source attempts to mitigate this by talking about mutual resonance and being stirred yourself, the very act of actively seeking out and identifying someone based on their perceived emotional vulnerability or lack, it raises significant, unavoidable ethical flags. You have to ask yourself constantly, are you genuinely connecting with another human being in their complexity? Or are you attempting to exploit a perceived weakness or emptiness for your own ends? whether for connection, influence, or something else. Understanding this tactic demands being acutely aware of that power dynamic and the potential for causing real harm by treating someone as a target.
It forces a real reevaluation of just passively waiting for connection. It describes something much more active, discerning, and, yeah, if not handled with extreme care, potentially manipulative. Very sobering point.
And moving on from finding the target, the third tactic described is create a need, awaken the hidden hunger. This is another deeply provocative one.
How so?
Because the source suggests that true seduction or deep influence in this framework doesn't begin by showering someone with pleasure or making their life easier. Instead, it starts by subtly identifying, qualifying, and bringing into focus what might be missing, what might be a source of silent unease in the other person's life.
That feels profoundly counterintuitive. We're usually taught to make someone feel good, comfortable, happy, right? To draw them in.
Right. But the source presents a starkly different view. It argues that a satisfied soul rarely questions its path. If someone feels completely content, fulfilled, lacking nothing, they have little inherent motivation for significant change, for seeking out new experiences or deep connections outside their current state.
So contentment is an obstacle in this view.
To this specific kind of deep transformative influence, yes. The core idea underpinning this tactic is that without desire, there's no movement. Tension, a sense of lack or incompleteness, is what initiates change, what creates the necessary dynamic energy.
And your role, according to the source, is to
Gently mirror their silent unease. It's not about criticizing them, but about reflecting back something they might feel on a deep, maybe unconscious level, but haven't yet acknowledged or articulated.
How would someone even do that?
The material suggests techniques like asking gentle, almost philosophical questions that probe their sense of self or direction. Things like, did you stop dreaming somewhere along the way? Or dropping small, seemingly innocent hints like sharing a personal reflection. I remember when life felt wilder, less predictable. It's presented not as manufacturing discontent, but shining a light on a potential disconnect between who they are now and maybe who they want it to be, or what they deep down long for.
Okay, I see. So you're not telling them they're lacking. You're sort of nudging them to feel it themselves.
That's the idea described, yes.
Yeah.
The analysis provided is that you are subtly stirring an itch they didn't even consciously know they had. You're giving form or voice to an unacknowledged restlessness, a hidden longing, a quiet dissatisfaction. By articulating something that resonates with their internal state, you bring it to the forefront of their awareness.
And here's the crucial, and again, ethically fraught turn described.
Hey.
When that hidden longing surfaces and is acknowledged, you become the potential solution.
Right. Not necessarily the only solution, but the person who saw them, who understood or articulated that hidden hunger, and who potentially resonates with the feeling of seeking something more. This positioning, the source claims, deepens attraction or influence not through overt drama or self-promotion, but by being the mirror they needed to see their own unacknowledged desires.
And it makes any comfort you offer later feel more potent.
That's the argument. Because you first acknowledged and seemed to understand their vulnerability or dissatisfaction, your subsequent presence, comfort, or shared experience feels more meaningful, more specifically tailored to their perceived need.
But the risks here feel huge and immediate, pointing out someone's perceived lacks. That sounds like a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And the source itself warns, albeit subtly, that bringing too much drama or being too heavy-handed will cause discomfort, defensiveness, and likely drive the person away. You have to keep it subtle, almost imperceptible in its intent.
And the stated purpose, it's critical again, supposedly to wake them to their own feelings, not to break them down or make them feel inadequate.
But there is an incredibly fine, almost invisible line here, isn't there? You are deliberately identifying and focusing on a potential area of dissatisfaction in another person's life. That's inherently uncomfortable for the person on the receiving end.
Yeah.
The vast difference between genuinely helping someone self-reflect supportively and deliberately creating or highlighting dissatisfaction in order to position yourself as the desirable solution, that's the line between ethical interaction and manipulation. Even though the source frames it as awakening, the potential for misuse and psychological harm is immense.
Think about how it feels when someone points out something you're maybe insecure about or suggests your life isn't quite right. It's almost always unwelcome, right? Triggers immediate defenses. Using this tactic requires navigating that incredibly delicate boundary with extreme care and, frankly, a level of ethical self-scrutiny that the source implies is necessary. Otherwise, you risk being seen as negative, judgmental, or worse, as intentionally trying to make someone feel bad about themselves just to elevate your own position.
And that brings us to the fourth tactic. Master the art of insinuation influence without force. This shifts the focus from identifying the target and stirring their internal state to the very method of communication itself. It emphasizes subtlety, indirectness.
Insinuation, so not saying things directly.
Exactly. The source describes it as a form of communication that whispers rather than shouts. It's about influencing someone's thoughts, feelings, or desires without applying any obvious pressure, force, or direct statement of intent.
Okay, why is that considered so effective in this framework?
Well, the explanation is quite compelling, psychologically speaking. Direct statements, straightforward arguments, bold claims, they tend to trigger the rational mind's defenses immediately.
Right, you put your guard up.
Precisely. People instinctively put up walls, become critical, search for counter-arguments when they feel they're being told something they might resist or that challenges their existing views.
But hints and suggestions, they bypass that.
According to the source, yes. They don't engage the critical mind in the same way. Instead, they're described as speaking more directly to deeper emotional levels. They land differently, subtly planting ideas like seeds in the mind without triggering an immediate counter-argument or rejection.
How does the source suggest you actually do this? Plant these seeds.
It talks about dropping bold ideas like seeds into the conversation, questions or statements that are significant in their potential implication, but left hanging, undeveloped. An example given is a question framed not as judgment, but possibility, like, at some point in your life, don't you feel meant for more than this?
It's a big question just left floating.
Exactly. The key, according to the material, is the delivery and the follow-up or lack thereof. Leaving these thoughts floating unclaimed, unpinned, but persistent. You pair a subtle suggestion with silence or a quick change of subject, allowing them to connect the dots. You don't explain the implication, you provide the pieces and let their own mind, their own desire for meaning, do the work of assembling them into a new thought that feels like their own.
And are there better times to do this?
The material points out it works best in quiet moments, times when the other person's mind is more relaxed, less guarded, maybe prone to introspection or wandering. During a relaxed walk, over coffee with comfortable lulls, or even a late-night text exchange when defenses are naturally lower.
Okay, but risks again. Surely this can backfire.
Absolutely. Overdo insinuation or use it clumsily, and you risk coming across as suspicious, evasive, unwilling to be direct, or just plain manipulative because your intentions feel hidden. The source warns explicitly to keep it crisp, gentle, and sparse. It's not about a constant stream of veiled comments.
So it's more like offering a path than a push.
It's framed that way, yes. Offering a path they gradually follow. The subtle nature is supposed to respect their autonomy, or at least give the illusion of respecting it, while subtly guiding their thoughts. But as we have to keep saying, that subtlety is precisely what can make it so ethically questionable.
Think about a time someone dropped a hint, and later you had this aha moment. Felt like you came up with an idea yourself, only to realize later it was maybe planted. That's insinuation at work. And while it feels less confrontational than a direct argument, it can be deeply manipulative because it bypasses your conscious filters and critical thinking. It's influence that's much harder to detect and defend against.
It requires a high degree of self-awareness from the person receiving it to recognize when a thought wasn't truly spontaneous, but was subtly, maybe intentionally planted. It really underscores the power of this tactic and why understanding it is critical for spotting potential manipulation.
And finally, we arrive at the fifth tactic described. Enter their spirit mirror to build the invisible bridge. This is presented as potentially the deepest, most powerful form of connection or influence described here.
Yeah, this one feels different. It focuses on truly captivating someone by meeting them, not in your world, but within their own internal landscape.
So transcending your own intentions and stepping into their perspective.
That's the core idea. Temporarily setting aside your own agenda, your fixed personality traits, and stepping into their emotional state, their way of experiencing the world.
Why does this idea of mirroring matter so much in this context? What's the power in it?
The source offers a powerful explanation. Everyone fundamentally craves understanding. And reflection, seeing aspects of themselves mirrored back in someone else's behavior, responses, emotional tone, is described as breaking down barriers almost instantly.
Okay.
The source claims, quite boldly, that we love ourselves most deeply when someone mirrors our inner landscape, implying this profound sense of validation and connection when we feel truly seen and understood on that level.
So what does this entering their spirit or mirroring actually look like, according to the source? Is it just copying them?
No, it emphasizes it's not about superficial mimicry like copying gestures or words. It's described as mirroring their emotional language, matching their pacing in conversation, aligning with their current mood, turning into their energy level.
So it's deeper than just imitation.
Exactly. So the source clarifies, not mimicking, but reflecting their inner state. If they're deep and thoughtful, you become thoughtful alongside them. If they're playful and energetic, you lighten up and match that energy.
And the intended outcome of this deep mirroring.
A significant fundamental shift in the dynamic. As the other person senses this deep alignment, this accurate reflection of their inner state, their psychological defenses are described as naturally lowering. You don't force your way into their world, you enter their emotional and psychological sphere naturally through resonance.
Okay. And once you're inside.
Once that invisible bridge is built through mirroring, the source claims your own ideas, your influence, your way of seeing things can then weave into their perspective gently and powerfully. Not through overt tactics or trying to establish dominion, but through resonance. Your thoughts find a receptive home because you're operating on the same perceived frequency, seen almost as an extension or reflection of their own spirit.
Wow. That sounds incredibly powerful. Almost beautiful in its description of deep connection. But there has to be a warning here, too.
Oh, a critical one, absolutely. The source highlights the significant risk of losing yourself in the process. It warns that if you become too much of a chameleon, constantly adapting without a solid anchor or loyalty to your own core perspective and identity, you risk losing your authenticity entirely.
So the goal isn't to become them.
No, the source insists the goal is not to become them or someone you fundamentally are not. It's described as an incredibly delicate balance. You have to actively resist the urge to lose your own identity. The aim is explicitly stated as connection through echo, not empty imitation. You reflect their spirit, you don't dissolve your own into it.
Let's connect this back again. Think about how powerful, how validating it feels when someone just gets you, your perspective, your humor, your intensity, your quietness, when they seem to intuitively match your rhythm. That's the positive, authentic side of this kind of reflection, isn't it? Feels like being truly seen.
Absolutely. It's a profound feeling.
But conversely, think about encountering someone who seems too much like you, too quickly, too perfectly, where the mirroring feels slightly off, or maybe overly performative. How does that feel?
Unsettling, yeah. Unnatural, maybe even a bit creepy sometimes. It feels inauthentic.
Right. And that unsettling feeling touches on the very risk the source highlights, the potential for losing yourself in the attempt to connect. Or, from the other side, encountering someone who lacks their own core because they're constantly adapting, which ultimately undermines trust and genuine connection.
It brings us full circle, doesn't it? Back to that core, pervasive warning running through this entire source material. These described tools are potent, they're capable of profound effects, and they require, above all, profound self-awareness and rigorous ethical consideration from anyone who seeks to understand or even just recognize them.
So let's just bring this all back to the beginning, that overarching message. The source is crystal clear. These are not gentle relationship tips. They're not feel-good ways to make friends. They're described repeatedly as sharp psychological tools.
Sharp is the word.
And the distinction, that razor-thin line between using them and misusing them, is starkly drawn.
According to the source, misuse is exploitation. Period. Full stop. It's using these described techniques to harm, control, or deceive another person for selfish gain.
But using these strategies consciously, and this is where the material presents a really challenging perspective. It's presented as a way to create authentic emotional resonance, something described as deep, magnetic, transformative. And that language itself highlights the fundamental tension we've been wrestling with. Can something born of such calculated observation and technique truly be called authentic? It's a tough question.
It really is, and the conclusion in the source reinforces the key principles derived from exploring these 5 tactics, drawing lessons from both their potential and their danger. First, it emphasizes that emotion must flow. Influence or connection in this framework isn't primarily about comfort or smooth sailing, but about managing emotional movement, relying on contrast, presence, absence, insinuation.
Right. Second, energy must be invested wisely. Circling back to choosing your targets, not just anyone, but those who are receptive, who resonate with you, who awaken something deep inside you. Suggesting that two-way recognition, however unequal it might be.
Third, depth requires trust. This principle highlights the necessity of subtlety over force. You can't bully or coerce someone into the kind of deep emotional connection these tactics supposedly facilitate. The approach has to leave room for their receptivity, their internal processing.
And fourth, spirit connection over strategy. The deepest influence described comes not from trying to dominate or apply techniques from the outside, but by entering, syncing, aligning with their spirit. Influence, at its most potent in this view, grows from resonance, not dominion.
But the danger, it's not just reiterated, it's amplified in the source's final paragraphs. Armed with these insights, the material states you can reshape interactions, ignite desire, forge powerful connections, spark passion. But the absolute, non-negotiable necessity is to always remain conscious. Conscious of the power, conscious of the effect, conscious of your intent.
You absolutely must maintain responsibility for the effect you have, and critically, respect emotional boundaries. The source uses that powerful analogy. Every technique, every insight is a key. But turning that key recklessly, without wisdom or integrity, can not only fail to open doors, but can lock doors or break trust irrevocably.
Yeah. It ends with this powerful, almost imperative call to action, but one grounded entirely in the warnings and the gravity of the subject.
Oh.
It doesn't say, go forth and conquer, but rather use insight, use integrity, use caution.
Right.
It acknowledges your presence is powerful and then directs you not towards mastery of technique alone, but towards wisdom. Now become wise.
And that directive, that final pivot from power to wisdom, in the context of such sharp psychological tools, it leaves us with a pretty significant question to ponder, doesn't it? Long after this deep dive ends. Given the intense power described here, the explicit dangers, the potential for exploitation, how can any of us even begin to navigate our own relationships and interactions where these dynamics might be subtly or even overtly at play, whether they're being consciously used by someone else or maybe even unconsciously enacted by parts of ourselves?
Or maybe pushing that reflection a step further, does the very act of dissecting and understanding these potent psychological dynamics, even with all the warnings and the focus on responsibility, does it fundamentally alter our capacity for genuine, spontaneous, maybe less calculated forms of connection, the kind that don't involve this level of analytical engagement?
Heavy thoughts, yeah. Definitely heavy thoughts to leave you with. But they're thoughts that resonate directly from the core tension and the crucial message of caution found throughout our source material today. Understanding the shadow side of influence, understanding these powerful keys and their potential to lock or break. Maybe that's the most vital first step towards navigating a world where they exist, ensuring you're neither consumed by them nor worse, wielding them without the wisdom the source demands.